Hello again. Welcome to another edition of Arts and Ideas. I'm Sue Swinand. And usually I interview other artists in central Massachusetts, but today I'm going to talk about my own work, primarily because I have a few shows coming up this fall, which I'd like to invite you to see. Since it's not an interview, I'm going to treat it more like a slideshow, and I'll be able to talk about each piece as I show it to you. If you want to see more of my work or find out more about me, you can go to my website and see more than you ever need to know, but it's www.swinand.com. A little over a year ago, I got a material needs grant from Arts Worcester, and I used the money to buy 10 large, gorgeous sheets of Arches watercolor paper, which have a wonderful surface and are extremely heavy. The idea was to try to balance the random organic patterns that water painting produces with the stability and the structure of geometry. I called the series Alternating Systems. 5 of the pieces will be shown at the Arts Worcester Aurora Gallery this September. It runs through September 29th, and the other 5 will be featured in a show called Water plus Color at the Schildkamp Gallery at Clark University here in Worcester. And that show runs from September 18th to November 9th. And I also, not last but not least, I have a show of small drawings coming up at Arts Worcester, opening on October 6th. And I'll tell you more about that later. I've been focused on the large watercolors for the last year, and but before I get into showing those, I thought I would like to show you a few other pieces that were formative in the last years, detours, experiments, discoveries, really the ideas that helped me move my work forward. I'm going to start off with some works that really focus on movement, which has been a continuing interest in my work. As you can see, these works are really loaded with powerful brushstrokes and gestures and I feel very dynamic and moving. I did this series, it was right after 9/11, and I was really trying to create raw, brutal imagery and almost like a savage energy that would express the whole horror of that time. A wise person once said, I think it was a Chinese philosopher, the brushstroke is the heartbeat of the artist, and I really do believe that. It's a wonderfully expressive element in painting. I was really just putting down brushstrokes to divide the space in an interesting way, but eventually they started forming into what I saw as figures, and these figures held all the energy that I was trying to throw into them. But I began to see them as dancing figures. And at the time, I remember thinking of a line I had read which said, Shiva dances and the world turns. And the idea there is that the cycle of creation and destruction is endless, an endless turning and cycling. And I realized too that painting nature, or a lot of artists say they paint from nature, but painting from nature doesn't always mean painting bucolic landscapes. There's a really dark side to nature as well. This last piece it deals a little bit more with shape than brushstroke, and here I'm discovering a shape which is still a dancer, but if I had tried to draw this shape consciously in the beginning of the artwork, it never would have taken this. I find these shapes in the process of working. The next series I'm going to show you is a series that focuses more on shape, and it's also still very involved with the idea of movement. But I was teaching visual communications at Clark at the time, And I became fascinated by the way abstract shapes could communicate or evoke ideas, and how slightly varying a shape could call forth alternate ideas. This series was called Formed by the Wind, and I wanted all the shapes to feel like they were in the act of becoming or in the state of transformation. The other thing I realized that everything in the universe is changing all the time, and that energy is acting on matter. And whether it's the energy of growth or melting or wind or gravity, energies are acting on matter, and that's what really creates form in the universe. So these are, I think, the shapes are very full of movement and energy, and I actually wanted the paint to feel like it was full of energy too. Sometimes I thought acrylic paint was lifeless and looked like a plastic bag, and I was really trying to activate the surface of the paint and make that energetic as well. And I did a lot of scratching and painting over and gestural marking in the surfaces of the paint. I was very interested in the way the shapes could evoke meaning. In these landscape ones that seem more like landscape, I'm actually using that horizon to kind of stabilize and give structure to the composition. Then I'm going to show you a series of watercolors that are dealing with shape also. And also you can see in this series how I'm trying to make the watercolor medium more physical and more textural. One thing I never liked about watercolor is that there's nothing there. It's just tinted water, and when it dries, it has no textural surface whatsoever. In this piece, I'm trying to use a piece of rough handmade paper, which emphasizes the particles. When I paint the wash, it kind of settles into the texture of the paper and really makes it a lot more physical and a lot more textural. Sometimes it's an illusion of texture where I'm putting patterns down. And I also used some dry abrasive media to contrast the flat washes. In this one, you can see that I used some opaque media where that little sort of pom-pom thing is. Most of the lights in the paintings are the white of paper, but my process is very intuitive, and I like that. I like that I don't know what the painting is going to become. I'm in a state of not knowing. And little by little, I discover the shapes and form the painting will take. As a painter, I feel our objective is to discover significant form. The other thing I wanted to tell about the watercolors is that I'm making these shapes by painting the darks around areas that I like. So painting in watercolor usually starts with light washes, and then you work the dark puddles around the light washes. I think this piece really shows that, where you can see the first color put down was that pale color, and then little by little the dark puddles create the shapes. If I had tried to draw this, I never would have been able, because when I draw out the painting or the canvas first and I paint it all in, it always looks contrived or predictable. So I like discovering the forms in the process of working. I realized my paintings were going more and more toward organic growing things. Maybe that was because I was teaching in the greenhouse, maybe at Wellesley College. I did a series of paintings which were called Thanks to the Angiosperm, but they were all imaginary plants. All of my paintings come out of my imagination, and I love finding something which I know something that's fun to look at or exciting or feels authentic when I find a shape that I like. But the paintings were getting so busy, it was almost like I was realizing that nature abhors a vacuum and grows into every possible area, and that there are little organisms growing on your fingertips and on your eyelashes and so forth and so on. So I started to long for some stability in these paintings, and I started using some grids and more geometric structures. But it was kind of funny because I pulled this slide out when I was looking for slides to include, and it's a very realistic painting, which I did from life, which I still enjoy painting from life. But you can see that the vines are extremely complicated and growing everywhere in a chaotic fashion. But I didn't even realize that at the time, but I used the grid of the trellis and the porch bar as to stabilize and give order to the composition. And this is a whole nother series that I did around that time, where I began using a lighter weight paper to intentionally let the water create some interesting patterns and shapes. So the water would pool in the as the thinner paper buckled. But you can see that I'm imposing this grid structure over those forms. And I called this series Liquid Geometry. And what I'm going for in these, or I'm trying to get more focused on, is the idea of stillness. So I'm using the horizontal bands and the circle to kind of stabilize all this random motion that the water creates. This is a close-up of some of that buckling and pooling of the water. And I also realized I could never paint anything as interesting as what the water made by itself. So my goal was to let the water go and get out of the way and give it as much energy as I could, and then try to organize it in some way. And this was a more recent attempt at doing that. I had a painting that was just terrible and it wasn't working, and I cut it up and pasted it back together again and worked on it again, and I kind of liked the grid organization to it. I think it was John Keats who said, the power of negative capability, of being in a bad place, of making big mistakes that you have to change and correct. It's only when you have big problems that you find new solutions that you haven't found before. So that idea of being in the unknown and traveling into an unknown area, that's when you really are able to create something new. Here's another example of using the grid, actually using the cross form, because the cross is a really archetypal symbol which balances the forces of the universe, the positive, the negative. They're in perfect equilibrium. And I thought the same was true for the circle, because I think it was Joseph Campbell who said, at the center of the circle, I'm sure he's not the only one, there is no movement. Like at the rim of the circle, the wheel of fortune moves, but at the center, there is no movement. So I kind of liked this image, which is watercolor also, but it seems like a potential energy, but at the same time, it's seeking stillness. And that's what I was really going for at this point, and I still am in a way. And I think that there's all the movable, changeable flux of nature, but beyond that, there's the universal, the absolute, the stillness. There's some stillness that exists in our universe. This series was, I painted the whole paper black. These are watercolors too. And after teaching watercolor in many places in many years, I realized that students were really having a hard time because they always start out with these very, very pale washes, and they were afraid to put anything down with any gusto. So I had them paint the paper black. And then what I did in these was we washed out the light areas. And it was really a new way of discovering shapes, and shapes, again, that I never would have thought of if I were drawing on my own. So I put pencil over the lighter area and kind of made it concrete. But I'm also using a little bit of opaque gouache in these. You can see in this one that the background is washed out and kind of rough and dirty, and I scratched into it while it was wet and created that powerful line that makes a pattern in the background. But the dark shapes were the first coat, and then the gouache pattern that looks kind of like a scarf, that's opaque white over the dark. This is one that employs collage and is a little bit more like a landscape, but I also loved the way these had the feeling of some kind of infinity or space or cosmic energy. This one is called Falling Moon, and again, I washed out the lighter areas, and I'm starting to experiment in this one with putting pieces of paper into puddles to create these sort of organic patterns. Same thing here. You can see I'm using a lot of the gestural scratching and scribbling in the what you might think of as the sky area, because it energizes those washes and gives them surface and more of a visceral feeling. Now these pieces I called human intervention, but basically what I was trying to do is give the watercolor as much power and energy and freedom as I could and get out of the way. I like telling students that for me, painting is like dancing the tango. You put your energy into the material, and the material does something on the surface, and you respond to what it does, and then you do something, and then so you're kind of partners with your material, and you're putting the energy into the material and then responding to the new reality that appears on the surface of the painting. So these don't look like I did a whole lot, but I did a lot of tweaking on these to make them have composition and pattern that I liked. I took a lot out and covered over, as you can see, with some of those darker washes to create more specific shapes. So now we're up to the 10 big watercolors, and I've always been interested in the idea of synthesizing this kind of chaotic, random action and fluidity of nature with some kind of more immutable structure. And so I started using the geometry again. I'm going to show you a few slides of the paintings and how I begin them. As I said, I'm really trying to put as much energy and power into the materials as I can. And you can see in this little detail that the paint is just doing all kinds of crazy things. And where there are puddles that are so runny, I'm throwing pieces of paper on them, and the paper is rippling and buckling, and all that contributes to making the paint more visceral and substantial. So what happens is I paint the whole painting, and then I'm thrilled by all the action and excitement that the water created, but I'm not satisfied with it as being a painting. And I feel like I need to give it some order and structure. Again, I'm a person who's looking for a painting to find significant form. I'm kind of a formalist. So in this series of puddles, I love the action, but I don't like the colors. I don't like those black balls. I don't like the way the directions are moving through the composition. So I begin to do some glazes where I'm looking for some shapes that I might like. And I'm also, by building up a glaze, which is just putting a transparent wash over a dry undercoat, what I'm doing is looking to direct the composition, looking to find shapes, looking to find out what I like. And so I'll do many, many glazes to bring out the things I love and to cover over the things that I don't like. I want to show you a few videos too, because I'm very fortunate, because my husband Lou Swinand is a great videographer, and I'm fortunate to have him to help me put this together here. And this one I did draw one circle and 2 lines just to kind of separate the washes for some break in the continuity. But you can see I've mixed up paint in a bucket so that I can work quickly. And I have a nice soft brush, and I'm spreading the water and letting it be as fluid as I can, letting it float on the surface. Now I'm mixing other colors. I like mingling the colors right on the paper. Part of the reason for that is to let each color have its own voice and life. If I mix the colors together and put them down, it's more of a monochrome, whereas when I put each color down separately, it holds its own place and it makes more of a coming and going in the wash. Also, you'll notice that the brush will create very nice, crisp, hard edges if I drag the brush along the line. The side of the brush, I never need to do masking, or I don't like masking or masking fluid. Both of those to me are not too much trouble. So now, do you notice I'm using a triad of yellow, red, and blue? And I'm going to let each of those colors have its own voice and let them kind of mingle together as they wish. And they will make dark and light, warm and cool, bright and dull, just by the way they run along the paper. Now you're going to have to pay attention here, because I'm flinging little droplets of water onto the damp wash. And you'll see how they create beautiful organic patterns that are so much like nature. Again, I could never design something that would be as true to nature. Nature really creates itself in this process. So I'm not doing an imitation of nature. I'm really letting nature create actual events on the paper. I'm not trying to copy nature. You know, it's interesting. Paul Klee, I years ago read his writings where he talked about wanting to discover the invisible face of nature, and not painting the surface of nature, but discovering the way nature forms, looking at the forming principles. And that was an idea that really appealed to me and carried me for many years. Now here's a good example of just glazing. You can see I took blue and then red, and I'm putting another wash over the first dry wash and letting the circle appear. The circle was not there before. And I'm just trying to mix up a good color here. What I'm trying to do now is sort of glaze some of the things that I want to make richer. You'll also notice I'm changing the direction of that straight edge. And you'll see how I can lift that up and make a correction. I decided I didn't like the angle of that square. And so I'm painting on this burnt sienna glaze, and that will soften the underpainting as the water sits on the paper. I'm taking my flat brush and I'm sort of rubbing back and forth side to side, and you'll see it's lifting off what's underneath there. I can erase those big patterns that are on the lower section. But I'm going to add even more liquid into this. Now I'm adding a blue tone mixed with the sienna, because I always like to have color that has sort of temperature range so that it has warm and cool complexities in it, because I think that gives color a sense of reality and real light. The last little video I have for you is just using some gouache. And, you know, right now the painting looks like nothing. It's completely, has no unity. The colors don't go together. So little by little, I'm going to work on making some things stronger, some things weaker, some things more complicated, some things richer. It's a process of discovery. Notice how much time I spent mixing that gouache on that little plastic palette. But it's important because it has to be the right consistency to flow. And I also have to have enough of it mixed up that I can cover the surface I want to cover. Because if I stop and have to mix up more, the edge will dry and I won't get a smooth wash. So that brings us up to the drawings, and the drawings are quite different. They're much more whimsical, much more just playful, really. And I like drawing at night when I'm tired. I just sit in my chair, and as Paul Klee said, you kind of let the line, take the line for a walk. And I never know what they're going to become. I don't know, usually I just try dividing space in an interesting way. And I was doing them on paper for years, but recently I started doing them on clayboard when I found out I was going to have this show. And the clayboard was for several good things about it. One is you don't have to frame it, and the other is you can correct mistakes. So if you're drawing without thinking and without knowing where the next line is going, you can make things that are you wish you hadn't. And on the clayboard, you can scratch out with a little razor, or you can put white lines in a dark field, or you can push an edge back a little bit if you don't like the edge. So it's been a great discovery. I'm calling this series All Together now. And the idea was that we are all in this together, just like the plants that grow against each other and influence each other. Another concept in my work over the years has been that every form and every action influences every other thing, every other form, every other action. There's always a reaction. You know, whether it's plants, animals, human beings, governments, corporation, we're all in it together. So this body of work is going to open at Arts Worcester at the Aurora, and it opens on October 6th. So I hope you can stop by and see it in the flesh, and I'd love to see you. And until then, see you next time for another edition of Arts and Ideas.